Minister, I'd just like to ask you to give an update on the number of specific new staff allocated to each local authority affected by the short-term letting regulations that you brought in, which were effective this summer, to implement the new rules around short-term letting in our local authorities that have the rent pressure zones. So what I'm trying to get a handle on is the additional resources that are in place now, and maybe what resources are planned to be put in place over the course of the next few months.
Minister Murphy has 2 minutes.
Thank you, Lass, and thank you, Deputy, for the question. On the 4th of June of this year, my department wrote to planning authorities with rent pressure zone designations, or RPZs, seeking estimated resource funding requirements for the implementation and enforcement of the new short-term letting provisions to cover the period until the end of 2021. My department wrote again to planning authorities on the 2nd of July and the 26th of September, seeking new or revised estimates following my designation of additional RPZs in certain parts of the country, which extended the application of the short-term letting provisions to those areas. The additional resources sought primarily comprise additional enforcement staff, but also include, inter alia, associated legal costs and IT costs. Since then, further communication has taken place between my department and all relevant planning authorities, seeking clarification and refinement of the resourcing requests, as well as in relation to the practical implementation of the short-term letting provisions. Under Budget 2020, €2.5 million is being made available to support planning authorities in the implementation and enforcement of the short-term letting legislation. And my department has now secured sanction from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform for this new funding provision. My department will be contacting local authorities shortly regarding both the recoupment of eligible expenditure in respect in the latter part of 2019 and their budgets for 2020. And pending this, planning authorities are enforcing the new provisions, including the recruitment of new staff, if required, from within their existing resources.
Deputy Darrell O'Brien.
I thought it was quite clear in the question was to ask how many additional staff per local authority, and I think what the Minister's come back with about clarifications, refinement of additional resources, additional funding. Now, I would be interested if you've secured additional funding, how much, but surely you have an idea right now, because the regulations came into force on the 1st of July, how many additional staff are in place to cope with that. Are you actually happy right now with the progress of this? Like, how many people have actually registered their properties under the new regulations? Are the departments keeping a handle on that? So this was an issue that both myself and others at the Housing Committee raised at the time, was about how this would actually be managed and would the resources be in place to manage it. So, you know, without being difficult, I would like to try to get some type of view for how many additional staff. Take Dublin City, Fingal, South Dublin and Dunleary Rathdown. Do you know how many extra have gone in there? And have all of those local authorities actually responded to your correspondence? You mentioned 2 dates, the 2nd of July, the 26th of September. Like, do your department have the information that they need? Do they know what the ask is from each of those local authorities? So I'm trying to get a handle on the actual numbers and the effect of these new regulations. Are they actually been implemented yet?
Thank you, Lass, and thank you, Deputy, for the follow-up questions. And there's a few parts in that, so I'll try and get to them all in this first reply. I mean, the first thing to say is that, you know, each planning authority already has a planning section and an enforcement section and everything else. So if we look at Dublin City Council, they have more than 170 staff. And it was quite clear in the first few months of implementation of these new laws that there would be a requirement on local authorities to reallocate from within resources. A number of their resources, for example, in Dublin City Council, were already dealing with short-term letting because it already was an issue for the city. What we did with the planning laws was clarify the legal situation from a planning point of view. But we did say that we would allow them to hire new staff, that the funding that we were going to provide for 2020 and 2020 on would be made available, and that we would try and recoup costs for additional staff hired in the course of 2019. We know the Dublin City Council want to hire, I think it's about 13 new staff. I've already started recruitment, so they've already taken on new staff. From all of the local authorities that are impacted, we have a request for in the region of between 50 to 60 new staff across those local authorities, in total, across those new local authorities between now and 2021. And we have funding available in the region of €2.5 million, which goes some way to meeting the costs, most of the way, meeting the costs of the additional staff that are required in the planning authorities. I can come back in the next contribution in relation to complaints, exemptions and everything else.
Second supplementary.
Yeah, well, that's useful to some degree, but to get from your answer, you're saying that in total across the affected local authorities, 50 to 60 additional staff. Do I take it from the fact that from your answer as well, that I can take it that there are actually no additional staff yet appointed, or are there any? I think that's important because, you know, the regulations in place since the 1st of July, there was a big issue was made of short-term lettings, and indeed it is an issue, not just by way of restricting the supply out there for long-term letting, but also in relation to enforcement that you have mentioned, rightly so here, about quality of life for neighbours who are living next door, particularly in apartments and things like that. So we know what the issues are, and certainly at the Housing Committee, myself, Deputy Bryn and others at the committee, we've spent a lot of time going through this. So I suppose I want to know what the effect of the regulations that you brought forward that are now passed have had in a period of time now that we're in early November. They've been in place over 4 months. So, you know, are you satisfied where this is at right now with the progress that is being made, and what more would you like to be seen to be done? And do you know from each local authority, have they told you what they need in additional funding per local authority?
Minister, 1 minute.
Thank you, Lásán Corda. Thank you, Deputy. Yes, each local authority has come back with the additional staff that they think they require and the funding that will cost out to 2021. And we are now engaging with them as to the actual funding that we have and what that means in terms of how many new hires they can have, but also how they might have to reallocate from additional resources within their own planning authorities, which is the section within the local authority that has to deal with this. Dublin City Council has recruited already additional people, but it's like of the 50 to 60 new staff, a lot of that recruitment still needs to take place. We are in a bedding down period, or we had been in a bedding down period. We now move to more rigorous enforcement. What I can tell you is that we've had 300 plus notifications to avail of exemptions. That's people who want to continue to home share, but won't be short-term letting unless it's under the 90-day cap. We've had 16 requests for a change of use. And in relation to complaints, we've had 370 complaints received from members of the public. 152 received warnings from the Council. 45 concerned property owners, which were subsequently issued with Section 154 warning notices, further to the subsequent inspections, and 160 of these cases were subsequently resolved to the satisfaction of the Council without the need to initiate court proceedings, and that means properties were put back into use for long-term letting or were sold. That's 160 of these properties. So that gives you an example, and there's 165 investigations ongoing. That gives you an example of the significant work that's already underway, and that's before all the new additional resources have been hired.